The palace didn't just reassign a calendar, it dismantled a queen consort's identity, and the king signed it himself. Let that land for a moment, because when the official statement came through confirming that Princess Anne would immediately assume all of Camilla's official state duties, most people assumed it was routine. A health matter, perhaps. A quiet reshuffling of an overcrowded royal diary. Something manageable, something temporary, something the palace press office could smooth over with carefully chosen language and a brief photo opportunity. But it wasn't any of those things. Not even close. What actually happened inside those palace walls over the preceding weeks was far more consequential and far more personal than any official announcement could capture. This was a reckoning 3 decades in the making. It involved a seating card altered without permission, a warning email deliberately ignored, a confrontation behind closed doors with no advisors present, and a king forced to choose between protecting his marriage and protecting the institution that his entire life had been built to serve. Before we go any further, hit subscribe to Palace Source so you don't miss a single update as this story continues to develop. Because trust me, we are only at the beginning. Now let's go through this properly, because the timeline alone tells you everything about how serious this breach actually was. Charles read the final transfer order alone. No aide stood beside him. No advisor summarized its implications. He sat with the document in front of him, read every line from beginning to end, and then placed it flat against his desk without uttering a single word. That silence was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of a man who had already made his decision and now had to live with what it meant. And what it meant was enormous. Official state duties are not simply appointments on a calendar. They are the core, constitutionally significant responsibilities performed on behalf of the crown itself. We are talking about ceremonial appearances at national events, patronage visits to institutions that carry the monarchy's formal support, diplomatic receptions where foreign representatives measure the health and stability of the British royal family, and formal engagements conducted directly beside the sovereign. These are not optional extras that can be quietly shuffled around without consequence. They are the visible proof that the monarchy is functioning, that it is present, accountable, and united. When Charles signed that transfer order, he was not asking his sister to cover a few gaps while his wife took a short rest. He was removing Camilla from the center of royal public life and handing that center to someone else entirely. He was authorizing a restructuring so complete, so formal, so deliberately documented that it could not be misread as temporary or accidental. He was making a statement, and the statement had his signature on it. Camilla received confirmation from a senior courier only minutes before the palace statement was released to the public. There was no private dinner conversation the night before. There was no compassionate briefing from a trusted advisor, giving her time to prepare herself emotionally. She learned what had been decided with the same narrow window the rest of the institution had been given, just enough time to absorb the news before the world knew it too. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an immediate audience with Charles or instruct her own team to begin drafting a counterstatement. Those who were present described her expression as something that moved slowly from disbelief into a particular kind of stillness. The stillness of someone who has understood not just what is being said, but everything underneath it. Because Camilla understood something in that moment that the official language of the transfer order deliberately obscured. This was not administrative. This was not structural. This was personal in the deepest possible way. And it had been authorized by the one person in the world who, above all others, she had believed was unconditionally in her corner. She wasn't just losing engagements. She wasn't just losing a schedule filled with hospital visits, diplomatic luncheons, and ceremonial appearances. She was losing the proof, the visible, documented, publicly witnessed proof that after 30 years of controversy, after decades of criticism and public hostility and tabloid campaigns and royal disapproval, she had finally, irrevocably earned her place. And the man who had fought beside her through all of it had personally signed that proof away. Princess Anne was summoned without ceremony. There was no elaborate protocol surrounding her arrival at the meeting where the decision was communicated to her. No formal gathering of senior advisors, no prepared statement read aloud in a gilded room. She was simply summoned, and when she arrived, she was handed a sealed briefing folder. Anne opened it, and found a revised royal calendar. Her name appeared across events she had never previously been scheduled to attend: state receptions, memorial services, patronage visits to institutions she had not previously represented, and diplomatic meetings where her presence would now carry the weight of the crown's formal commitment. The folder was thorough, it was detailed, and it had clearly been prepared well in advance of the conversation she was currently sitting in. That preparation revealed something important. This decision had not been made hastily in the days immediately following whatever incident had triggered it. The groundwork had been laid, the logistics had been worked through, the calendar had been restructured, all of it done before Camilla had been formally told, before the confrontation that would supposedly precipitate the decision had even concluded. One line inside the briefing folder carried particular weight. Read it, paused over it, and read it again. The transfer of duties, it stated, would remain in force until the sovereign determined otherwise, not until a review was completed, not until a set time frame had elapsed, until the sovereign, Charles, alone, decided differently. In plain language, Camilla would not reclaim these duties unless her husband personally decided to return them. There was no automatic review, there was no built-in restoration, there was only Charles, and whatever he chose. Anne turned to the first engagement listed under her newly assigned authority. It was a major state reception, one that Camilla had been planning for months, one that included a welcome speech she had written herself, every word chosen deliberately, every phrase crafted with Charles in mind, because she had believed, truly believed, that this reception would be the moment the monarchy formally confirmed that she belonged at its center. Anne closed the folder. She felt no victory. She felt the particular, uncomfortable weight of a person asked to step into another woman's place, while that woman's marriage was quietly fracturing under the pressure of her husband's own signature. To the watching public, Princess Anne and Camilla had always occupied entirely separate corners of royal life. They were different in temperament, in background, in the way they moved through public duty, and in the nature of their relationships with the institution itself. Anne had built her reputation over more than 5 decades of relentless, disciplined, complaint-free service. She was the princess who showed up, who completed the engagement, even when the schedule was exhausting, the weather was miserable, and the cameras were intrusive. Who understood the constitutional boundaries of her role, with a precision that made palace advisors trust her above almost anyone else in the family. Her work rate was legendary. Her personal controversies were virtually non-existent. When the palace needed stability, it reached for Anne, because Anne had never once given it a reason not to. Camilla's journey had been defined by something entirely different. Her place at the center of royal life had been earned not through decades of unquestioned duty, but through decades of public endurance. She had been one of the most scrutinized and criticized women in British public life. The hostility she faced from sections of the press and sections of the public had been sustained and sometimes genuinely vicious, and yet she had remained. She had stood beside Charles through the years when standing beside him cost her enormously, and she had eventually arrived at a position that no one, 30 years earlier, would have believed possible. She was queen consort. She was at the center. She had won. Except that the relationship between these two women, the one who looked naturally trusted and the one who had fought for every inch of acceptance, had never been as straightforward as the formal royal calendar made it appear. Behind the polished smiles and the careful coordination of public appearances, a far more delicate balance had been operating, and now that balance had broken. The duties being transferred were not simply professional responsibilities. They were the architecture of Camilla's public identity. Every engagement on that calendar was a visible statement that she had a right to be there. And watching them transferred, watching her name crossed off, and another name written over the top, was not a professional adjustment. It was an erasure. Here is where the story actually begins. Not with the announcement, not with the signed transfer order, not even with the confrontation in the private sitting room. It begins 3 weeks earlier, at a diplomatic ceremony of considerable significance, where a single altered seating card set in motion everything that followed. The Commonwealth Service of Renewal had been planned for months. The guest list included representatives from across the Commonwealth, foreign diplomats, and senior members of the royal family. The order of precedence, the official ranking that determines where each royal figure stands, sits, and is positioned during formal events, had been approved well in advance through the proper channels. Anne had been placed beside the king during the central presentation of the ceremony. This was not an honorary position given out of familial affection. It had been assigned because Anne was leading the formal presentation of a new Commonwealth initiative. Her position beside Charles was constitutionally appropriate and operationally necessary. It had been approved. It had been documented. It was settled. Then, minutes before the ceremony was due to begin, Anne noticed that her seating card had been revised. She had been moved behind two less senior representatives. She had been removed from the position beside her brother during the central presentation, the one she was there specifically to lead, and the revised arrangement had not come through official channels with official approval. It had come through Camilla's office. The order of precedence is never a trivial matter inside royal protocol. Changing it is not a harmless detail, not even slightly. Every position in a formal royal lineup sends a message about authority, about hierarchy, about the monarchy's internal confidence. And every diplomat in that room understood how to read those messages. They were trained to read them. Reading them was part of their job. Anne folded the revised card once and approached Camilla privately, keeping her voice low, her expression controlled, and her question direct. She asked whether the change had been deliberate. Camilla did not deny it. The queen consort replied that the monarchy must reflect the king's household first. It was a carefully constructed phrase, designed to sound principled and institutional, but its meaning was unmistakable. Anne was being repositioned, not because of any constitutional concern, not because the original arrangement was logistically flawed, but because her closeness to Charles had been interpreted as a threat. Her natural authority inside the palace, her effortless credibility with advisors and foreign guests alike, had apparently become something that needed to be managed. Anne said nothing further. She returned to the position she had been assigned, completed every element of her duty with absolute precision, and protected the dignity of the ceremony, while absorbing an insult that would have caused most people to break protocol entirely. She did not break it, not publicly, not once. But the damage had been done, and it had been done on the basis of a decision made using the king's name, a decision Charles had never authorized, never approved, and never even been consulted about. Charles discovered what had happened only after the final guest had departed. A senior courier placed the original, approved ceremony plan beside the revised version that had actually been implemented and explained precisely what had occurred. His authority had been invoked to justify the change. His name had been used to approve an alteration he had never sanctioned, and the woman responsible had received a documented warning, a written email sent directly to her office hours before the ceremony began, explicitly stating that the approved order must not be altered. She had received the warning, she had understood it, and she had proceeded anyway. Charles stared at both documents on the table in front of him for a long moment. He was not simply looking at a ceremony that had been slightly restructured. He was looking at evidence that his authority, the constitutional authority of the sovereign, not merely his personal preferences as a husband, had been borrowed without permission to settle a private dispute over rank and proximity. When he later asked Anne why she had remained silent throughout the ceremony, rather than confronting the situation publicly, her answer was simple and precise. She said she would never embarrass the crown in a public setting, but she would not allow the same thing to happen twice. That answer stayed with Charles. It told him several things simultaneously. It told him that Anne understood the difference between personal grievance and institutional damage in a way that prioritized the institution absolutely. It told him that the incident at the Commonwealth service had not been a one-time miscalculation. It told him that if something was not done, firmly, formally, and quickly, it would happen again. And it told him, perhaps most painfully, that he had allowed a situation to develop inside his own household that his most disciplined and trusted family member had been silently absorbing for long enough. The meeting Charles convened was not announced in advance. There were no photographers permitted, no secretaries present to take notes, no ceremonial formality to soften the edges of what was about to happen. He chose a private sitting room, and he chose it deliberately, because what needed to be addressed existed simultaneously in two registers. It was personal, and it was constitutional. He entered first. Anne followed. Camilla arrived last. When the door closed, the three of them were alone with the documents Charles had placed on the table between them, the original approved ceremony plan, the revised version that had actually been used, the ignored warning, and the email that demonstrated, without ambiguity, that the alteration had been made with full knowledge that it had been formally rejected. Camilla spoke first. She had clearly decided on her position before walking into the room. She insisted that she had acted to protect the dignity of the sovereign's household, that those closest to the king should be positioned at the center of royal events, that the palace could not indefinitely bend its internal arrangements around what she characterized as one woman's excessive sensitivity to minor adjustments. Her voice was controlled, the anger beneath it was not. Anne responded without raising her voice at all. She said the issue had never been about where she stood physically at a ceremony, it was about something far more serious. The king had approved one arrangement. A different arrangement had been imposed in his name, without his knowledge, after a formal written warning had been received and ignored. She looked directly at Camilla and stated the accusation without softening it. Private insecurity had been placed above public duty, and there was documentary evidence on the table that made denial impossible. Then Charles asked the question that had no comfortable answer. Had Camilla known, when she authorized the change, that the revised order had already been formally rejected? The silence that followed lasted long enough to answer the question on its own. Then Camilla admitted it. She said she had seen the warning. She said she had believed that once the ceremony was completed, Charles would understand why she had made the decision and would support it retrospectively. The confession was more damaging than any denial would have been, because it didn't describe a misunderstanding, or a miscommunication, or a failure of palace administration. It described a deliberate choice. She had seen the instruction, she had understood it, and she had decided that her private judgment superseded the documented will of the sovereign. Charles removed his glasses and set them beside the papers on the table. Then he told them both that an emergency transfer of duties had already been drafted. Camilla's expression changed instantly, and in that change, she understood something that transformed the entire nature of the meeting. This was not a warning. It was not an opening negotiation. It was not the beginning of a conversation about consequences. The decision had already been made before any of them walked through that door. The confrontation was not designed to produce a resolution. It was designed to deliver one. She rose from her chair and faced her husband one final time in that room. Whatever she had felt walking in, and she had clearly felt a great deal, she channeled it into a single, precise challenge. She told Charles that signing the transfer order would accomplish something beyond weakening her position. It would answer a question the palace had never officially acknowledged: who truly held authority inside the monarchy's inner circle, and whether a decision of this magnitude was being made by the king alone, or by a group of advisors who had already quietly determined that Anne represented a safer institutional future. It was a dangerous question to raise, because it forced Charles to either defend the independence of his decision or acknowledge that the machinery of the palace had been moving toward this conclusion for longer than the immediate crisis suggested. Royal power rarely announces itself with a single dramatic gesture. It moves through private secretaries and legal language, through calendar adjustments and carefully worded briefing notes, through the quiet consensus of people whose entire professional purpose is to protect the institution from the kind of damage that cannot be repaired. Charles may have been the one whose signature appeared on the transfer order, but the machinery that produced that order had been turning for days before it was placed in front of him, and throughout that process, one name had emerged again and again as the answer that everyone around the king trusted most: Anne's. Charles's private office had spent the preceding days working through the full scope of what a restructuring would mean in practical terms. The royal calendar for the coming months was extensive. It included patronages connected to dozens of institutions, planned foreign visits with diplomatic significance, investiture ceremonies where the sovereign's representative presents formal honors to members of the public, military commemorations, and state receptions already confirmed with foreign governments. An investiture, for those unfamiliar with the term, is not a minor administrative event. It is one of the most symbolically significant things the monarchy does, a ceremony in which the crown formally recognizes individuals for their service and contribution. Canceling or postponing such duties would cause embarrassment domestically and signal uncertainty internationally. Replacing Camilla gradually, through a slow and carefully managed transition, was not a viable option. The palace needed someone who could step into the full scope of these responsibilities immediately, without any visible hesitation that might suggest internal instability. Anne was the answer, not because she had lobbied for the position, not because she had expressed any desire for expanded authority, but because she was the person the palace trusted absolutely, precisely because she had never once given it a reason to doubt her. Her workload was already demanding. Her understanding of constitutional boundaries was precise. Her record of avoiding personal controversy that might complicate her public appearances was essentially perfect. Her discipline made her the strongest possible choice. But that same discipline created an uncomfortable problem. The more clearly dependable she appeared, the more deliberate Camilla's removal would look to the outside world. Not temporary, not administrative, permanent and personal. William received a private briefing and chose his words to his father with considerable care. He told Charles that Anne could stabilize the institution, protect the calendar commitments, and reassure foreign guests who had built relationships with the royal family over years. He acknowledged that the decision was probably the right one for the monarchy. And then he delivered the warning Charles had been working hard to avoid thinking about directly. This decision might save the monarchy's public face. It might also permanently damage the king's marriage. Charles listened to that assessment and then said something his advisors had not anticipated. He acknowledged that he had failed both women. He had failed Camilla as a husband by allowing the insecurity between her and Anne to deepen over years without ever confronting it directly or setting firm boundaries about where personal rivalry ended and institutional duty began. He had failed Anne as a brother by expecting her to absorb quiet humiliations in the name of family peace, repeatedly, silently, without ever demanding that the behavior causing those humiliations be addressed. He had protected the appearance of peace. And in doing so, he had allowed trust to break entirely beneath the surface of it. Now he was facing the full cost of that silence all at once. The transfer order was circulated before dawn. One recipient forwarded it immediately to Camilla's household. By the time most of the palace was waking up, the decision had already escaped the room where it was made. Camilla's team began the process of dismantling the official life that had been constructed around her public role. The most devastating sign of what had changed was not any public statement. It was not a hostile headline or a pointed question at a press briefing. It was something far more mundane and far more brutal. It was an empty calendar. Engagements that had carried Camilla's name for months disappeared from the royal diary one by one, each crossed off and replaced with Anne's. Hospital visits that Camilla had personally prepared for, diplomatic luncheons where her presence had been formally confirmed, military commemorations where she had already begun the process of learning the names of the people she would be meeting, the state reception she had spent months planning, including the welcome speech she had written herself. All of it gone in a morning. Camilla sat with her private secretary as briefing books were removed from her office. Briefing books, for context, are the official files that contain everything a senior royal needs to represent the crown effectively: schedules, background notes on the people they'll be meeting, historical context for the events they're attending, guidance on appropriate responses to sensitive questions. They are the practical infrastructure of royal duty. Without them, a senior royal cannot function in an official capacity. They are, in a very real sense, the physical manifestation of institutional access. Their removal made the transfer real, in a way that no formal announcement had managed. The announcement was language. The empty shelves were a fact. Camilla asked whether any official duty remained under her direct authority. Her private secretary hesitated before answering. The distinction he was obliged to draw was precise and deeply painful. She could continue private charitable contact. She could support causes personally, write letters, offer encouragement and assistance. But she could not appear on behalf of the monarchy. She could no longer speak with the authority of the crown behind her words. She could still care. She could no longer represent. The fracture extended into her own household. One longtime aide refused to transfer to Anne's team and resigned immediately, saying, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that personal loyalty was not something that could be reassigned like a diary entry. Another aide accepted the transfer without protest. Camilla learned both decisions within the same hour and understood precisely what they revealed. Even the people immediately around her were now making choices about which mattered more: personal attachment to her or institutional survival within the palace structure. The line had been drawn, and everyone was deciding which side of it to stand on. Charles sent a handwritten note, not a formal summons through official channels, not a message relayed through an aide. He wrote the request himself, in his own hand, and had it delivered privately, hoping that something personal might reach Camilla in a way that official communication no longer could. She read it once, then she set it down beside the empty shelf where her briefing books had rested, and she left it unanswered. Her silence was not composure. It was the last form of control available to her. Anne learned that the note remained untouched. And something shifted in the way she understood what she was being asked to do. Performing these duties while the human damage remained entirely unaddressed would not be service. It would be participation in something that felt, under those specific conditions, uncomfortably close to a silent punishment. Before she appeared at the state reception that had been Camilla's, before she stood at the lectern and delivered the welcome that Camilla had written, she needed to have the conversation that everyone else in the palace had been too cautious or too self-protective to arrange. She crossed the palace alone. No aides announced her arrival. No official record was created of what followed. She arrived carrying neither the duty folder nor the formal authority that had been placed in her hands. She simply knocked and walked in. Camilla was waiting beside a closed diary, her posture communicating that she had prepared herself for accusation. Anne offered something more difficult than accusation. She offered the truth without any of the institutional padding that normally surrounds difficult conversations inside royal life. She told Camilla directly that she had never sought this reassignment. She had not campaigned for it, had not encouraged it, had not positioned herself as an alternative in any conversation with the king or his advisors. Every engagement she was now being asked to fulfill would carry the weight of another woman's loss, and she was not capable of feeling anything like triumph about that, because she understood too well what had been taken away and what it had cost to build. But she had not been able to refuse, not when the crown's stability was at stake, not when foreign guests were waiting for confirmed commitments and the royal calendar had obligations attached to it that could not simply be suspended while the institution resolved its internal tensions. Charles. Camilla listened. Then she admitted something she had not been willing to say in front of Charles. The altered seating card had come from insecurity, not from a genuine constitutional conviction that Anne's position needed to be reconsidered, not from a principled assessment that the ceremony would function better with a different arrangement. It had come from the fear of comparison. Anne's credibility inside the palace looked effortless, the product of a lifetime of uncomplicated, uncontroversial service. Camilla's place beside the king had been built through years of resistance and public hostility, and it sometimes felt, even now, as though the foundation beneath it was not entirely solid. Every time Anne stood close to Charles, Camilla felt the contrast. One woman looked naturally trusted, the other was still, in some private corner of herself, trying to prove she had a right to be there. Anne did not soften the truth in response, but she revealed something Camilla had not known. She had requested a formal review of the transfer after 3 months, not because she expected to relinquish the duties, but because she wanted the arrangement to remain subject to the king's genuine, ongoing consideration, rather than hardening into something permanent by default. She had not asked for permanent control. She had explicitly made sure she couldn't have it without Charles actively deciding to give it to her. Then Camilla opened the reception folder, the one containing the speech she had written weeks earlier, and she removed the pages carefully. She handed them to Anne. She asked only one thing, that the opening tribute remain unchanged, because it had been written to honor Charles, not to mark her own position, and it still honored him, regardless of whose voice delivered it. Anne accepted the pages, and for the first time in that encounter, Camilla looked at the woman across from her, without seeing an enemy. By the time Anne arrived at the state reception, the announcement had already become a national event. Every broadcaster was covering it. Every commentator had a position. Every photograph was being studied for signs of triumph, resentment, or barely contained institutional rebellion. The image that defined the moment was not taken inside the reception hall. It was taken seconds before the doors opened. Anne standing with Camilla's handwritten speech in her hands, her thumb resting across a line near the center of the page, the line Camilla had nearly asked to be removed, and had ultimately decided should stay. Broadcasters interrupted regular programming to explain the significance of what was being witnessed. This was not a single substitute appearance. Anne had assumed the complete state schedule, every engagement, every patronage, every diplomatic commitment that had carried Camilla's name. A state reception, for context, is one of the most formally significant events the Crown hosts. A gathering where senior royals formally welcome diplomats, officials, and honored guests on behalf of the entire institution. Any sign of confusion or uncertainty at such an event would send a signal far beyond the palace walls. Anne delivered the welcome. She spoke clearly, without hesitation, and she began with the tribute Camilla had written for the king. Camilla watched the broadcast beside Charles. She heard her own words spoken by another voice, and she felt something rise in her that she could not entirely name: grief, and something reluctant that was adjacent to pride pressing against each other in the same moment. Her words were still serving the crown. She no longer had the right to speak them. But they were still there, preserved, unchanged, delivered exactly as she had written them. Charles watched his wife watching the broadcast and said nothing. He could see that the moment was painful. He could also see that Anne had made a choice, a deliberate, visible, documentable choice, not to erase the woman she was replacing. A photograph of Anne holding those pages reached the front page of a national newspaper before the reception had even concluded. The headline beneath it read, "The duty passes, but the words remain." Outside the palace, a crowd had gathered. One woman held a handwritten sign that read, "Service without revenge." Others around her repeated the phrase. Cameras found the sign and held on it. The public had identified the meaning of the moment, not the fall of Camilla, but Anne's explicit refusal to turn that fall into something humiliating. After the reception, Camilla sent word that she was ready to meet Charles. They sat opposite each other in a private room with no statement prepared, no advisors positioned outside to manage the outcome, and no ceremonial language to hide behind. Charles spoke plainly about what the transfer meant and what it did not mean. The duties would not be returned in the near term. Returning them quickly would undermine the decision and suggest that the sovereign's formal authority could be overridden without lasting consequence. Camilla listened to everything. Then she spoke about what the loss had actually cost her in terms that had nothing to do with protocol. She said that losing the official schedule felt like losing the final proof that their long struggle together had been worth enduring. The years of public hostility, the sustained criticism, the resistance from within the family and from outside it, all of that had seemed bearable because the monarchy had eventually, formally, visibly given her a place at its center. That place was the proof that the struggle had meant something, that it had led somewhere real. Now that proof was gone. And Charles did not dismiss what she was telling him. He acknowledged that the loss was real, that the pain was real, and that he was not able to reverse the decision. Then he admitted his own failure again, not to his advisors, not in careful language designed for institutional consumption, but directly to his wife. His silence over the years had allowed the tension between the two most important women in his family life to deepen to the point where it had eventually produced a crisis that cost everyone involved something they could not fully recover. He had prioritized short-term peace over long-term trust. He had protected one relationship by quietly damaging another, and then, when the accumulated damage finally broke through the surface, he had discovered that protecting one relationship at another's expense had actually weakened both. That evening, Anne received a handwritten message from Camilla. 2 sentences. She asked Anne to protect the charitable causes attached to the transferred duties, and she promised she would not interfere with the revised arrangement. No demand for public acknowledgement. No attempt to negotiate the terms of her own restoration. Just 2 sentences, and in them, the first clear signal that acceptance had genuinely begun to replace resistance. Anne incorporated those charitable commitments into the revised schedule without alteration. She refused to erase work, simply because authority over it had changed hands. The decision she made in that private revision communicated something that no official statement could have conveyed as clearly. Taking on responsibility did not require diminishing the person who had held it before. Duty could be firm without becoming punitive. The transfer of duties from Camilla to Anne became, in the end, the clearest possible statement of the monarchy that Charles intended to lead. Not a monarchy that prioritized personal affection over institutional accountability. Not a monarchy where the authority of the sovereign could be borrowed and used to settle private disputes without consequence, but a monarchy where official trust had to be earned continuously, protected deliberately, and never, under any circumstances, deployed without the genuine consent of the crown it was meant to serve. When Anne stepped forward while Camilla stepped back, the palace did not hold a celebration. It did not produce a triumphant narrative about institutional correction or the vindication of proper procedure. Three people had been wounded by what happened, wounded in ways that would not simply close when the announcement cycle moved on to something else. But the institution had survived. Not because Charles made a dramatic and decisive gesture of sovereign authority, not because Anne was uniquely qualified in ways that made the outcome inevitable, but because, in the end, three people who had all been damaged by the same crisis found a way, privately, painfully, without cameras or applause, to accept the cost of what accountability required. Duty without trust is ceremony. It is form without substance, appearance without meaning, the performance of responsibility with none of its genuine weight behind it. But duty guided by accountability, duty that is willing to face what it costs, to acknowledge what it damages, to carry someone else's words to a lectern and deliver them unchanged out of respect for the person who wrote them, that kind of duty can still protect a crown, even when everything underneath it is cracking. Stay subscribed to Palace Source, because this story is not finished, and the next chapter begins in 3 months, when the formal review arrives, and Charles has to decide again.